Welcome back, Bio3D Prep. We're going to finish off the digestive system with this lecture by looking at some of the disorders of the digestive system. In your textbook, it's pages 233 to 239, and also on page 486 is some more information on hepatitis. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to identify the relationship between digestive health and nutrition, and you'll be able to identify the symptoms and causes of several conditions that adversely affect the digestive system. For the first part, and a lot of this is going to feel kind of like common sense, and some of it might feel like you've heard it before. Good nutrition obviously is going to affect our body's ability to perform. It's going to affect our physical abilities, intellectual abilities, and even our emotional state. If you think about it, our body really is just one big machine. Physical abilities, obviously we need energy if we want to do things, and we have to have the enzymes to catalyze reactions. So we really need we need protein. Otherwise, even if all the energy is there aren't those little machines to catalyze reactions to make things happen, to actually access that energy. And for intellectual abilities, it's much the same idea. Our brain uses something like, and I hope I get the number right because it's been a while since I looked, but something like 40% of our energy needs for the brain. Which means if the energy is not there and the protein isn't there to catalyze reactions, our intellectual abilities are severely hampered. So good health, we think about it mostly with our physical abilities to walk, run, play, all that kind of stuff. But it really does influence intellectual abilities and even emotional state. A lot of what we're feeling is biochemistry. It's chemicals in the brain stimulating certain nerve cells. If we don't have those chemicals there, then it can affect our emotional state, either causing depression or other kind of mental disorders. Now, obviously, these things are also affected by genetics, and that's something we don't really have a control over, but we do have control over our nutrition. So our digestive health depends on a balanced diet, getting regular rest and exercise, and also having a positive self-image. These three things are what keep us healthy, both in terms of digestion and our body in general. So when these things don't happen, and when we look at the digestive system, what we're really going to look at are disorders that affect our ability to absorb nutrients or salts or water. If we can't absorb these things into our body, then our health is going to be compromised. Here's some examples of the disorders we're going to look at here. We're not going to look at them in any great detail, and it's by no means a exhaustive list. There's plenty of other disorders out there. To talk about all of them would be a course all unto itself. So here we'll take a brief look at ulcers. They're caused when the mucus layer of our stomach is worn away by stomach acid. So if that mucus layer, that protective mucus, starts to wear away from our stomach lining, then the acid and the pepsin get into our stomach lining and start breaking it down. And that's what an ulcer is. It turns out that a lot of ulcers are aided by a foreign invader, a bacteria, Helicobacter pylori. You don't have to memorize the name, but what it does is it attaches to our stomach lining and then prevents the mucus from growing on those sites or being produced at those sites. So they smother the mucus cells, and now there's a spot on our stomach that is no longer protected from stomach acid and from the action of pepsin. Other things that can affect the development of ulcers, and these are kind of well-known effects. Smoking, caffeine, alcohol, and stress are also associated with ulcer formation. What they're going to do is either sorry, I'm talking a little fast there, is either one of two things. They're either going to increase acid production in our stomach, or they're going to decrease the mucus production in our stomach. Either way, we end up with the same result where the acid starts to eat away our stomach lining. In terms of treatment, the easiest, and the one that's probably done the least, is dietary adjustment. By adjusting our diets, by choosing different foods or different habits, we're able to either reduce the cause of ulcers or reduce the spread of ulcers. There's medication that can either reduce acid production or increase mucus production. Antibiotics, if it is a bacterial infection, then antibiotics, of course, can kill off that bacteria. If they're bad enough, ulcers can be removed by surgery, which is usually a last result because that requires, cutting somebody open and then getting to their stomach and cutting a piece out and sewing it shut. Another disorder is inflammatory bowel disease. It usually refers to inflammation of the small intestines, and it's usually painful. So an inflammation is caused by infection. And there can be a variety of different things that cause the infection. For example, Crohn's disease, it's actually an autoimmune disease. So it's possibly that our body is seeing our bowels as being foreign, which is a bad thing. So our immune cells start attacking our intestines. So Crohn's disease, it's an infection of the intestines. It can form ulcers in the small intestine. It's possibly autoimmune. Autoimmune means that our immune system is attacking a part of our body. It's hereditary, and there's no real known cure. So most of it's monitored through diet or through medication. Our symptoms can be reduced. Through medication. I've also heard reports that sometimes certain yogurts with certain bacteria can actually alleviate the symptoms of Crohn's disease as well, but that's something you want to talk to your doctor about if you're worried about it. Colitis is another. It's similar to Crohn's disease. It's ulcerations of the colon, so ulcerations are holes in the colon. Similar symptoms to Crohn's, but usually less severe. Hepatitis, cirrhosis, and gallstones. These are all infections or disorders, I should say, of accessory organs. Hepatitis, there's 3 types, and they're characterized by how they're transmitted. Type A is transmitted through drinking water, B is spread through sexual contact, and C is most commonly spread through contaminated blood. Cirrhosis, it's scarring of the liver, and so the scarring, it's almost cirrhosis you can think of as being a symptom. And it's usually a symptom of something else. A couple of examples are hepatitis C can cause scarring, alcoholism, as that alcohol enters our liver isn't able to convert it quickly enough into something less toxic and actually damages our liver cells. If we lose enough liver, then we have a couple of problems. Problem number 1 is we can no longer detoxify chemicals. So as we produce ammonia, and every time we break down proteins, it turns out there's a little bit of ammonia produced. If we can't turn it into urea, then we start actually poisoning ourselves because we can't get rid of it fast enough. Also, one of the major roles of the liver is to store glycogen, our carbohydrate or energy store. And if we can't have that, a couple of things can happen. We can end up producing more fat in our body, or we can also start feeling just tired and lethargic since we don't have enough energy reserves available. Gallstones are hard masses inside the gallbladder, and what it's caused by is crystallization, a crystallization of cholesterol. If cholesterol levels get too high, then as bile is produced and put into from our liver into our gallbladder, in that bile are high levels of cholesterol to a point where they start crystallizing out of solution. So normally they're in solution, they're dissolved in a liquid, no big deal. If the concentration gets too high, and you can think about if you dissolve, say, sugar in a cup of hot water. If you dissolve enough sugar in that cup of hot water, as the water cools, you get crystal formation inside the cup. And the same thing is happening, only it's happening inside your gallbladder. And so those crystals get too big to fit through the duct that leads to your small intestine, and that causes pain, because every time you eat fats, your gallbladder wants to secrete bile, but there's a great big rock preventing bile from flowing through. Not only that, but your liver continually produces bile, and there's no way for the bile to exit the gallbladder, so that builds up pressure inside the gallbladder. Here's some pictures of some of our disorders. If we take a look at ulcers, or some diagrams of them, I should say, not pictures, you'll see inflammation and scarring in areas around the stomach. Same thing in for inflammatory bowel disease, so ulcers will be this one. And inflammatory bowel disease is over here, and what you'll see is really just a reddening, and you'll see the tissues looking redder, and some of it's actually starting to disintegrate or fall away. The lining is actually getting thinner in spots. And cirrhosis of the liver, all these little white spots are now non-functioning liver cells. So in this picture here, it's showing a widespread breakdown of liver tissue. Every one of these white spots is scarring tissue or connective tissue. And so it's a little spot on the liver that can no longer do the job that it used to do. Those are, I guess, the more physical disorders, ones caused by either eating habits or other lifestyle habits. Anorexia is a psychological disorder, and it's associated with the fear of gaining weight. It's a self-inflicted starvation, and by definition, people have anorexia if their body mass is less than 85% what is considered to be normal for their height. It's resulting from a distorted self-image. Usually people see themselves as overweight when they're looking at themselves in a mirror, despite the fact that they're not. Once you reach this 85% of normal body weight, it turns out that you don't have enough mass to actually keep your body standing. So you're low on energy reserves, low on muscle, so it becomes taxing to move limbs. Limbs are heavy, made of bone. If you don't have the muscle to move them around, or the energy cells, either the carbohydrates or the fat stores, to actually give those muscles energy, a couple of things are going to happen. Low blood pressure. As your heart loses muscle mass, it becomes weaker. Irregular heartbeat, constipation, your bowels start shutting down because they're not being used. And so if something's not being used, it atrophies. The digestive system can shut down permanently, and this prevents even the absorption of any nutrients, even if they're being taken in. Once anorexia reaches this stage, it's life-threatening. Another disorder of the digestive system, or I guess a complex disorder, is obesity. Hugely studied, tons of issues when we talk about obesity. There's hormonal factors, genetic factors, both in terms of physical. Sometimes it's just a matter of, and I shouldn't say just a matter of, but metabolisms, psychological, and these are things, if you think about things like comfort eating, or depression. Depression can often lead to obesity because eating that food grants a kind of release from that depressive state. Technically speaking, body mass has to be over 20% of what's ideal for a person of a specific height. And it depends on muscle mass, but most of the time, if you're 20% over what you should be, you're classified as obese. Treatments vary depend on what the influences are on a particular person, but 99% of the time, this is the big thing that needs to be done, is always healthy diet, and for the most part, the Canada Food Guide is a reasonable choice in terms of how much of which types of foods people should be eating. There's also physiology, and this relates to the obesity thing, but it also relates to other physical disorders as well. The majority of people in the developed world, so when we think about Canada, United States, and Europe, have a high carbohydrate diet and a high fat-based diet. I mean, when we think about these two things, we tend to eat a lot of breads, potatoes, and a lot of meats. And generally speaking, meats are high in fats, especially when we think of things like beef is a high-fat meat. And most cuts have a fair amount of fat, especially if you compare them to something like a fish or a plant, and most plants have very little fat at all. High carbohydrate, especially quick carbohydrates, white breads, sugars, that kind of thing. Now, these diets have developed over the past 10,000 years. So about 10,000 years ago, people started having agriculture. Before that, every person on Earth was a hunter-gatherer. And so we had this a diet that had a wide variety of foods, lots of fruits and nuts, and still maybe high in meats, but nowhere near all this carbohydrate intake that we have. And even the meats, most of the meats would be from hunted game as opposed to herded game, and we have a much higher access to meat now than we did 10,000 years ago. Now, populations of European and Asian descent have had 10,000 years for their body to adapt to this diet. Or they adapted to the diet slowly. So as agriculture first happened, it increased our intake of grains a little bit, and then we got better at agriculture and better at agriculture until it became more a part of our diet. Aboriginal populations in North America and Australia really didn't have access to that kind of diet until 600 or 700 years ago when it was brought over from Europe. And so they had a more traditional diet, and depending on which population you're talking about, they were usually high in protein, and even for Native North Americans, higher in animal fat, but especially Inuit populations. But those carbohydrates were almost non-existent, especially quick carbohydrates. Everything was a complex carbohydrate from a grain food. I mean, at best you could say along the East Coast there was a lot of corn, but compared to bread grains, the carbohydrate intake was much less. Europeans come over, introduce farming, introduce grains, and these grains have quick carbohydrates, and especially now when we look at today's food intake with a lot of fast food, it affects generally Aboriginal populations have a higher incident of heart disease and circulatory disorders because their bodies haven't adapted as much to this high level of carbohydrate intake. And they found that individuals who switch to more traditional diets are at a lower risk for getting these disorders. So our physiology does play a role in how we digest food and how nutrients affect our physical health. What you should be getting from this lecture is just a general overview of what happens if things go wrong with your digestive system. This is the end of the digestive system, and this is a good picture of what you should know when you're going into a test or quiz. And what I would say is if you can draw a picture like this and then add the details to it, you're in good shape. So when we talk about, for example, the mouth and teeth, we know there's physical digestion because we're chewing. Initial breakdown of starch, we should list the enzyme. You should know your enzyme names, where they occur, and what type of nutrient they're breaking down. And same thing when you start going through the esophagus, transport to the stomach, but we know that involves peristalsis. So what I would do is take a picture like this, draw it out on a nice large legal-sized piece of paper. Oops. So legal paper, and you want to maybe do it long-wise like this. Draw your digestive system here, and then start labeling the processes that are happening in each spot. So for the stomach example, we know there's physical digestion, initial breakdown of proteins. You want to write down how does that occur, right? You want to talk about pepsin. You want to talk about the activation of pepsinogen, the presence of acid, how the mucus protects our stomach, all that kind of stuff. And there's little reminders on this diagram. So for example, we know this is a low pH environment. How does our body protect itself from that pH, or even why? Why do we have this low pH environment? And the answer is we need to activate pepsinogen, right? Other things, so for chemical digestion, small intestine, you want to talk about all the enzymes. There's chemical digestion of all nutrients. List your enzymes. Say what they're breaking down and how they're doing it. Talk about regulation. Right, and here you want to list your hormone paths that we talked about. What hormones are related to which enzyme, and even just a couple or one example of a a negative feedback loop to show how it's being regulated. Absorption into the bloodstream and absorption into the bloodstream and lymph. And here they tell you what, but you should also talk about where is the active transport for glycerol, for fats. There's a bit of processing. We should talk about that as well. So on a picture like this, you want to get this nice diagram, and it's one way to do it. I mean, there are different ways to study for this. I like the diagram method where you draw a picture of the system and then label what's happening in the different parts. And I think the digestive system really lends itself to this. So go through, talk about the processing, the packaging, how it gets into your circulatory system from the lymph, all that kind of stuff. So legal paper, or even if you got poster paper, a piece like that, draw out some kind of sketch of your digestive system, and then list all the details. You want to be talking about enzymes, bile, all kinds of stuff, what's happening in the stomach, and for the large intestine, storage of feces also. Don't forget to mention the reabsorption of water. So these are the kinds of things you want to be doing for your digestive system. Once you're done this, you should be getting yourself ready for the digestive quiz, and after that you can go into the respiratory system.